History of International Climate Policy. In 1979, the world held its first major international meeting on climate change, the World Climate Conference in Geneva, Switzerland. This marks the moment when scientists and policymakers began connecting the dots between human activity and global climate shifts. The conference issued a declaration calling on the global government to foresee and prevent potential man-made changes in climate that might be adverse to the well-being of humanity. Recognizing the important role of science and data, it also called for the creation of a World Climate Programme, WCP. Between the early 1980s and 1990s, a number of intergovernmental conferences on climate change were held. Increasing scientific evidence propelled these conferences to raise international concern about climate change, eventually leading to a call for global climate action. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, was formally established by the UN Environment Programme and World Meteorological Organization in 1988 to assess the state of existing knowledge about the climate system and climate change, the environmental, economic, and social impacts of climate change, and the possible response strategies. It released its first climate assessment report in 1990, confirming scientific evidence for climate change and serving as a starting point for policy decisions to act on the most up-to-date information. Though it is a scientific document, every line must be agreed to by policymakers, making the IPCC report somewhat political and scientific in nature. The Second World Climate Conference, convened in 1990, called for a framework treaty on climate change. This was the first time 137 countries convened to negotiate and host ministerial-level discussions on climate change. The final declaration, adopted after significant bargaining and compromises, recognized the need for a more formal convention and a common but differentiated responsibilities approach to tackling climate change, such that countries most responsible for it were mandated to play a stronger role in minimizing it. In December 1990, the UN General Assembly approved the start of treaty negotiations via an intergovernmental negotiating committee for a framework convention on climate change. The committee met 5 times between February 1991 and May 1992 with the goal of creating the convention by the Earth Summit in Rio later that year. The 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro was a defining moment for global climate and environmental action. World leaders adopted 3 Rio Conventions. UNFCCC, that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. UNCCD, Convention to Combat Desertification, and CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. These early events paved the way for the annual Conference of the Parties, known as COP, where nations meet to negotiate climate action. The first climate COP was held in Berlin in 1995, and the journey continues today.